This continues the lengthy trial before the Roman procurator, Pontius Pilate. In the original Greek manuscript, there are no chapters or even verses, so this simply carries the narrative forward. We learned last week that Pilate, after examining Jesus, was convinced that Jesus was innocent of the charge that he was a dangerous revolutionary aspiring to become king instead of Caesar. Mark, in his Gospel, tells us that Pilate realized that it was because of envy that the chief priests had brought Jesus to him. Mark chapter 15, verse 10. Jesus was a king, all right, but a king over a kingdom of truth-seekers, more of a philosopher in Pilate's mind than an actual king. So when he brought Jesus out again, he said, "I find no crime in him." Chapter 18, verse 38. And he offered them a choice, either to release to them a notorious criminal named Barabbas, or Jesus, the King of the Jews. They immediately shouted, "Not this man, but release Barabbas." It surprised Pilate that they would choose a notorious criminal instead of Jesus. But rather than give in to their demands, Pilate tried yet another way to cool their hatred. We're told in verse 1 to 3, "Then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, 'Hail, King of the Jews!' and struck him in the face with their hands." Why at this point did Pilate decide to have Jesus scourged? In Luke's account, Pilate said to the Jesus accusers, "You brought me this man as one who was perverting the people, and after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. I will therefore punish him and release him." Luke chapter 23, verses 13 and 16. This indicates that Pilate was trying a new strategy to release Jesus. He thought that if he had Jesus punished by scourging, that they would be satisfied with this lesser form of punishment than crucifixion. Then after this punishment, he would release Jesus. The Romans utilized three types of punishments by beating. The first was called fusticatio, a less severe beating for lesser crimes. The second was flagellatio, a flogging for more serious offenses, and verberatio, a scourging, the most terrible of all, and which was always associated with other punishments, including crucifixion. Since in Mark's Gospel, Pilate delivered Jesus up to be crucified immediately after the scourging, it is likely that this was the more severe type of scourging, the verberatio. One scholar describes this type of punishment as follows. The delinquent, that is the criminal, was stripped, bound to a post or a pillar, or sometimes simply thrown on the ground, and beaten by a number of torturers until they grew tired, and the flesh of the criminal hung in bleeding shreds. 3 different types of whips were used. On free men, rods were used. For slaves and non-free men such as Jesus, the whips or scourges were leather thongs attached to a rod, and each leather thong had a spike or pieces of metal, bone, or lead attached to them. The prisoners who suffered this type of scourging were so severely cut and battered that they sometimes died of the scourging, and apparently this was the type of scourging which Jesus endured. Continuing, the soldiers who were charged with the scourging of Jesus no doubt heard that this Jesus claimed to be a king, so they made the most of it. They engaged in some cruel horseplay. They staged a mock coronation of this King of the Jews, and, since he is a king, Why, then he must have a suitable crown. The soldiers looked for some thorns, and wove them into a crown of thorns. In the ancient world, they sometimes depicted Oriental god-kings on their coins. Their crowns looked like rays of the sun spiking outward from their head. This produced a radiate crown. The thorns they used, Greek word is akanthai, have been identified with various species, but a strong case has been made that they were the great thorns of the date palm tree, which were readily available. The largest of these thorns was as much as 12 inches long, so a crown made of such thorns would make Jesus look like one of these god-kings with spikes emanating from his head. Such a crown would also be extremely painful when forced down on a person's head. Then they took a purple robe, for purple was the color of royalty, and put this on Jesus. Matthew and Mark add that they put a reed in his hand so that he looked like a king seated on a throne with his scepter in his hand. Then, according to Mark's Gospel, they called together the whole battalion, and they clothed Jesus in a purple cloak, and plaiting a crown of thorns, they put it on him. Then they began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck his head with a reed, and spat upon him, and they knelt down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him in this way, they stripped him of the purple cloak, and put his own clothes on him. Chapter 19, verse 4 to 5. Pilate went out again and said to the Jews, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." So Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man!" Pilate apparently hoped that the sorry spectacle of a man bloodied and disfigured by a severe flogging and dressed up in mockery, that this would satisfy Jesus' accusers that he had learned his lesson and that Jesus was no longer likely to do any harm. That Pilate introduced Jesus in such pitiful condition and said, "Behold the man," may indicate that Pilate was saying, "Here he is, poor fellow," as if to say, he looks more like a tramp than a king. But there is also the possibility that John, who writes this account, discerned in Pilate's words a deeper significance, just as he did in the words of Caiaphas in chapter 11, verse 49 to 52. And Mark's discerning in the centurion's words in Mark 15:35, a confirmation of his own basic emphasis on Jesus as the Son of God. Perhaps John heard in Pilate's words an echo of the prophet Daniel's, "One like a Son of Man, who was brought before the Ancient of Days and given dominion and glory and kingdom." The book of Daniel, chapter 7, verse 14. But if Pilate thought the pitiful spectacle of the terribly bloodied and battered Jesus would cool their hatred, he was mistaken. When the chief priests and their officers saw Jesus, they cried out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him, for I find no crime in him." The Jews insisted, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he claimed to be the Son of God." The chief priests and their associates were in no mood to be pacified by Pilate. The sight of the battered and bloody Jesus dressed up like a beggar king enraged them all the more. Perhaps it seemed like Pilate was mocking them by telling them, "Here's your Jewish king." At the very sight of Jesus, they started screaming, "Crucify him! Crucify him! Crucify him!" This unexpected reaction of the Jewish leaders infuriated Pilate, who shouted back, "Take him yourselves and crucify him." Pilate, of course, knew that they could not do this even if they wanted to, but it indicates his angry frustration and disgust at their unrelenting hatred of Jesus and their unwillingness to allow Pilate to release a man he deemed to be innocent of their charges. The Jewish leaders, now frustrated and violently angry with Pilate, finally blurted out the real reason why they wanted Jesus dead. They said, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he claimed to be the Son of God." They realized that Pilate was not about to accept their claim that Jesus was a threat to Caesar, so they finally gave the real reason they wanted Jesus dead, the one already decided on before Caiaphas the night before. Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, and that was blasphemy deserving of death. The Roman governors of Judea not only had the duty of enforcing Roman law, but they also had the responsibility, when necessary, of enforcing Jewish religious law. The claim to be king of the Jews was a capital offense against Roman law, but the claim to be the Son of God was a capital offense against Jewish law. Even though the Jewish leaders had failed to get Jesus condemned by Roman law, maybe Pilate could be persuaded to permit the execution of a blasphemer according to Jewish law. If Pilate refused to send Jesus to the cross for sedition, maybe he would agree to his execution for blasphemy. This new charge by the Jewish leadership had a more profound impact on Pilate than they expected. Pilate was deeply disturbed by this new charge, personally disturbed by it, because he had already sensed something in Jesus far beyond anything he had ever experienced in any other person. An element of fear had crept into Pilate when he had privately examined Jesus before. Now that same fear gripped his heart anew. The Jews might scoff at Jesus' claim to be God's Son, but Jesus had already told Pilate, "My kingship does not derive from this world." And hence this pagan Roman had superstitious ideas. And since he had superstitious ideas, this Jesus now became scary to Pilate. He would have to examine this Jesus again. The trial was far from being over.